Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Danielle Shanley will defend the academic thesis, Making Responsibility Matter, the emergence of responsible innovation as an intellectual movement. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Assessment Committee and supervisors, dear friends and family, thank you all for being here today. I'll take the next 15 minutes or so to try and give you a little taste of what it is that I say inside the pages of my thesis, Making Responsibility Matter, the Emergence of Responsible Innovation as an Intellectual Movement. Technology, hero or villain? So reads the title of a 1967 op-ed article published in the LA Times. It states, where once America had been a land of boundless optimism, by the late 1960s, increasing pessimism seemed to reflect a sour assessment of progress. Concerns about poverty, crime, racial strife, sonic booms, smog, electronic super snooping, insecticides, and automation were all contributing to the depressing feeling that technological progress was creating new problems as fast or even faster than it solved old ones. Across much of Western Europe, too, science and technology were the subject of increasing public ambivalence. For while modern technology may not have been producing the utopia it once promised, it was clear that its absence wouldn't either. Hero or villain, utopian or dystopian, good or bad? If you think for a minute about what you see in the media today, the landscape is full of similarly opposing claims. From public figures and tech journalists, CEOs and politicians, it's almost impossible to avoid the hype surrounding technologies like AI, self-driving cars, cryptocurrency, or virtual reality. Depending on which paper you read in the morning or which radio station you listen to, you might think these technologies are going to make life easier for us all, making us happier and healthier in the process, or that their benefits are sensationalized, that their risks are largely unknown, and that those involved in their development are unethical, immoral, and solely interested in turning a profit. In my thesis, I'm not interested in whether technology is considered a hero or a villain. Instead, I'm interested in discussions surrounding what it means to develop technologies responsibly, and how technological change may trigger us to reevaluate what responsibility means. Though thinking about what responsibility means in the context of scientific research and technological development is far from new, around the turn of the millennium, responsibility became an increasingly important concept in relation to research and innovation. Of course, contemporary ideas surrounding responsibility, whether that be in policy or academic discussions, did not emerge out of nowhere. Rather, they're part of a long history within which different ways of understanding responsibility have been made to matter. This, therefore, constitutes the central question of my thesis, which is, within discussions surrounding research and innovation, how have different ideas about responsibility been made to matter? For example, we might think about how responsibility matters with regards to either the processes or societal impacts of technological change. For example, within the research system, codes of conduct and ethics committees have become commonplace. So too have a number of research funding criteria. For example, researchers are regularly required to include multiple perspectives in their research, to think about the possible impacts of their research, and to attain some form of ethical clearance before even starting their research. Research funding is also often organized around particular themes or focus areas, such as the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Today, all of these are broadly captured under the banner of responsible innovation. Since around 2010, the term responsible innovation has become a popular way of thinking about whether or not we can define the right outcomes and impacts of research and innovation, and subsequently, if we can agree upon these outcomes, whether we can be successful in directing innovation towards them. Internationally, this way of talking about responsibility-related concerns gained considerable traction, particularly in the Netherlands, the UK, Norway, and parts of the USA. As a result, at a variety of meetings, research groups, projects, and networks, all have been involved in defining and institutionalizing the idea of responsible innovation. In that responsible innovation broadly reflects valuable and worthy ambitions, it is clearly quite difficult to be against. As some have rightly asked, who could possibly be for irresponsible innovation? Yet, at the same time, the ambitions of responsible innovation do reflect a very particular set of concerns, over and above, or perhaps even at the expense of others. Since the early 2000s, responsible innovation has largely been considered a new approach, despite occasional gestures to its foundations extending back many decades. For example, in the first editorial of the Journal of Responsible Innovation, the editors provide a short list of predecessors and acknowledge that responsible innovation was clearly an heir to earlier endeavors. In fact, given the long and varied history, some have asked, somewhat provocatively, whether responsible innovation is simply new wine in old bottles. Such critiques notwithstanding, in recent years, responsible innovation has become one of the most prominent frameworks for describing and prescribing the relationship between society and technology. Yet, surprisingly, the ways in which specific earlier debates, as opposed to generic references to earlier endeavors, potentially shaped contemporary ideas about responsible innovation have been largely overlooked. It's important to remember that as a way of envisioning responsibility and putting responsibility into practice, responsible innovation was not always already a matter of concern for academics or policymakers. Rather, responsible innovation came into being in a historically specific process that was shaped by previous approaches and methods, which were also historically rooted in visions of how science and society ought to relate. As such, the web of evolving influence extends back into distant history. As a result, there's not one single origin story of responsible innovation. Instead, its history is a collection of the people, places, and practices through which ideas about responsibility have been enacted over time. History is therefore an important lens through which we can try to understand how and why particular visions of responsibility have come in and out of focus over time. Now, given that ideas about responsibility in relation to research and innovation do extend back into distant history, an important question is, of course, where to begin. This is a Google Ngram, which is a tool that sorts through the entire Google Books library for terms or phrases and charts how frequently they are used throughout literature over time. As you can see here, a search for the term responsible innovation suggests that prior to its uptake in the late 2000s and early 2010s, use of the term had previously seen peaks in the mid-1960s and early 1970s. This suggests that perhaps there's something going on around that time that's worth investigating. During the first year of the PhD, I spent time with people who were working on, with, or around the concept of responsible innovation. I went to conferences and seminars, participated in workshops and social labs, and sat down to talk with a variety of people involved with the idea at different levels in different ways. I learned that responsible innovation was often referred to as a sort of umbrella term, as it captured a lot of different ideas together under one banner, or as a body of thought. It was also called all sorts of other things, such as a subfield, a bubble, a community, and a bandwagon. All of which raises the question as to what is the history of responsible innovation a history of? Applying any one of these labels would result in a potentially different history being told. But like any research, doing historical research means making choices, in the knowledge that these choices will have practical ramifications for the ways in which particular histories get told. Based on my time spent in and around people working with responsible innovation, I started to see it as something of a movement. According to Scott Frickel and Neil Gross, there are typically a number of commonalities among what they call intellectual movements. They suggest that they typically have some sort of coherent intellectual program, that they reflect a degree of contention, that they're inherently political, that they require collective action, and that they are episodic, and that at the same time, they can also range in intellectual scope, from ambitious to modest, progressive to reactionary. Thinking about responsible innovation as an intellectual movement helped me to think about how similar previous movements had emerged, consolidated, and developed, and allowed me to zoom in on earlier movements, tracing some of the factors which allowed them to emerge, gain prestige, and achieve some level of institutional stability. These factors included, for example, the actions of particular individuals, the existence of appropriate conditions, as well as the framing of particular ideas. The 1960s and 1970s undoubtedly saw the emergence of several social and intellectual movements, as well as a variety of different policy experiments, many of which sought to help societies and their representatives make informed choices about technology. Moving back and forth between data collection and analysis, I came to see the relationship between technology and social change, the potential implications of technological change, and the role of individuals' actions on technological choices as core themes which connected contemporary responsible innovation with intellectual movements which emerged in the long 1960s. I then traced the emergence of three prominent previous movements that sought to help society make informed choices about technology. I visited archives and spoke with people who were involved in these movements in order to try and get a sense of the outcomes and consequences of earlier collective efforts geared towards making research and innovation more responsible. As I tried to show, it is not particularly helpful to look at the outcomes of intellectual movements in terms of just success or failure. Instead, we might think about them in terms of their ebbs and flows or the ways in which they change shape over time. Now, of course, another important question I pondered regularly throughout the PhD was why should anyone be interested in a history of responsible innovation? And while numerous books and articles have made the case for why history matters far more extensively than I can now, I'll briefly make the case for why I think history matters for responsible innovation. First of all, looking critically at history helps to show us how things could have turned out differently. Often, the way we talk about history suggests that the wheels move in one direction. For example, within the literature on responsible innovation, history is often used to support its objectives, providing a neat frame of reference for how things came to be in the present, essentially presenting the emergence of responsible innovation as the logical outcome of prior developments. From this point of view, responsible innovation is seen as an inevitable product of the past. Less linear narratives, like the ones I tried to present in my thesis, help to demonstrate the extent to which people have found visions of responsibility unconvincing, or at least only temporarily convincing, over the years. We can also look to history as a valuable resource. In policymaking and innovation, the emphasis is often on looking towards the future. Though it's undoubtedly positive that we widely encourage anticipation of the future, it means that we tend to overlook the lessons of history. In the case of responsible innovation, I tried to show that critical historical reflection does not only add nuance and depth when thinking about the imagined trajectories of techno-scientific developments, but can also provide important insights for thinking about the possible futures of the responsible innovation movement itself. In this sense, history may potentially offer us some guidance in the present. For while the present is never the same as the past, we can still learn important lessons from how things went before. Or, as the old adage goes, history doesn't repeat, but it sometimes does rhyme. I suggest that understanding the successes and failures of earlier movements could potentially inform and shape how we talk about and practice responsible innovation today. Finally, the history of responsible innovation also has intrinsic worth. The history of responsible innovation is simply a history worth remembering. But it is, of course, important to consider who it is who is doing that remembering. Historical reflection on responsible innovation when it did or had taken place tended to come from insiders speaking from their own first-hand experiences. Such accounts are, of course, valuable and informative, yet at the same time, it is important to distinguish between practical pasts, which are largely based on individual experience and used as a main means for people to make sense of their own lived experiences and convey it to others, and historical pasts, which are the result of critical inquiry. There are three final reflections that I would like to leave you with today that relate both to the research that makes up the pages of my thesis, as well as to the process of doing a PhD. The first is about the importance of balance. I talk a lot about the concept of ambivalence in the book, specifically about how the individuals I studied often appear deeply ambivalent towards technological change. But I also try and reflect on my own ambivalence, both with regards to technological change, as well as towards intellectual movements like responsible innovation more specifically. On this basis, I suggest that we should perhaps consider ambivalence as an intellectual virtue and as a way of potentially making responsibility matter. For in the end, making responsibility matter within research and innovation often means attempting to strike a balance between opportunity and need, evolution and revolution, and continuity and change. Through the course of the PhD, I've come to see that embracing ambivalence might also be a way of ensuring that we carefully contemplate all of the options available to us before figuring out what action to take. My second reflection relates to the pile of rocks I chose to put on the front cover. Known as a rock cairn, these rocks seem like a particularly appropriate symbol for my project, as not only were they a way of visually representing balance, but their meanings are also multiple. They are often interpreted as navigational aids, effectively connecting the past with the present, while at the same time providing a signpost to the future. In this sense, they remind me of the importance of both looking forwards as well as looking back. For example, reminding ourselves of the diversity of 1970s experiments in making technology more socially relevant has implications for similar experiments like responsible innovation today. Like rock cairns, ideas about why responsibility matters have withstood political storms and changing policy winds before. While some ideas about responsibility may have eroded and faded away, others have merely changed shape, poised to reemerge under the right conditions. My final reflection concerns the role of hype. Whether it be surrounding a new technology, a new concept, or a new research program, one of the problems with responsible innovation has been that it focuses our attention on innovation, on the next big shiny thing which promises to disrupt, transform, or otherwise alter the way we live our lives, for better or worse. Responsible innovation itself was also presented as being new and transformative. Of course, there has always been hype around what is new. But the problem is that this hype often clouds some of the real problems that we have and perhaps should be thinking about. It might be less exciting to think about infrastructures or maintenance, for example, about the kinds of things that are essential to keeping things running. But if we are truly going to think about responsibility and about what enables anything resembling the good life, then we also have to think about the systems, processes, and people that keep these shiny things running once they become a part of our daily lives. Thank you for listening, and I now hand the word back to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Haro van Lente, who is chair of the Assessment Committee and is also Professor of Science and Technology Studies here at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidate, first of all, I would like to congratulate you with this very well-written thesis, and you address the history of RRI in a compelling way. You correct the so-called folk theories, and you study in a very nice way how these developments have been part of all kinds of histories. I was also impressed by how well embedded in various literatures your study is, in particular STS, of course, but also it draws on general social theory, such as on social movements. My question, and there are questions, of course, is on the latter. So I have a question about the way you address and conclude, especially about intellectual movements. You say they play a role in the production of trajectories of change, and that they might give rise to all sorts of outcomes. But how exactly they do this, that is not so clear for your thesis. So you could say you give important lessons for STS, for those who are concerned with responsibility. But what are the lessons for those who are interested in intellectual movements? In chapter 5, you address the question whether we should not just only look at success and failure, and I agree with you, there are more outcomes to be studied there, but what exactly is happening? Would you agree that there are some pathways to be studied, or mechanisms, or patterns? My question to you is, what are the specific contributions for the study of intellectual movements that your research have contributed?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind compliments and for your question, which I think, is something that I spent quite a bit of time thinking about. I think because I sort of came to using intellect, or to thinking about responsible innovation as an intellectual movement sort of halfway through, or certainly more and more as I started to wrestle with writing up the thesis. Because I think, as I mentioned, within the responsible innovation community and within STS, responsible innovation is called all sorts of different things. It's called a bubble and a bandwagon and so on. And obviously, as I say, depending how you treat it, it would shape sort of how I put this narrative together. And the more I started to think of it as an intellectual movement, the more that sort of made sense for me, and tracing these sort of, what goes beyond the sort of narrower histories of responsible innovation, or as you say, the folk histories that are typically presented. As you say, I try to sort of draw out a little bit what the lessons for responsible innovation might be, specifically, at this particular moment when responsible innovation is perhaps in a transitional period. But I think when it comes to the lessons for intellectual movements more specifically, I think, as you say, I sort of hint at various kinds of outcomes. From what I could see, very few people so far had really mobilized or utilized this intellectual movements theory. There was a few people that talked about, a few different outcomes, which essentially to me still sounded like success or failure. People would give them different labels, but it was, to me, they often just seemed, like they were still referred to success or failure. I think I try and talk a little bit about sort of recombination and layering and sort of different ways in which movements might build upon each other, or as I say, sort of ebb and flow and reemerge. But I think what I struggled with is really how you then go from there. And I think that's something I was sort of starting to get to right towards finishing the book, which in a way was nice, but also kind of frustrating, because it was, I feel that it is something that I would like to take further, because I think you need to look probably at quite a long period of time, like you say, in order to be able to explore these pathways and the sort of trajectories. I think you need to, I started in the 60s, 70s, making these connections between contemporary movements like responsible innovation now. And I think really, if I could then go on and look at what will happen with responsible innovation next, for example, in this sort of next shift, and really look at then, okay, how can we inform intellectual movement theory, and how can we take it to that next layer, where we're not just saying that, even if we give it fancy different words, it's essentially just success or failure. How can we really tease out what are these different outcomes? I think that's something I'd certainly, really like to take further.
If I may, one try further. So is you now in your answer, you focus still on outcomes and how to characterize them. And I agree, it's not really satisfying only to focus on success and failure, or the other outcomes that are mentioned. So on page 204, you talk about the outcomes of Larry Au on incorporation, balkanization, rejection, and so on. Still a bit more like success and failure, I agree. But what happens in between? So what kind of patterns or mechanisms or pathways are visible during it still is there? And I felt, that you would come up with this other fourth outcome, say infrastructuring, so that there are different ways in which something still continues to exist, although it's not visible anymore. So. And still then, so it's a question, but also an invitation to really continue these very important ways of addressing these histories.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with you, and I think you're right, trying to offer a more fine-grained analysis of exactly what happens in these trajectories. So as you say, looking at from when the sort of patterns or mechanisms of emergence through, and I think I try to use ambivalence a little bit in doing this, really showing how I think ambivalence can be used to sort of make sense of those trajectories. So in the first empirical chapter, for example, really showing how as this movement is sort of forming and taking shape, this sort of early proto-STS movement is starting to take shape, that it was really because they were open to exploring different options of kind of, the different pathways that it could take, that it allowed and gave room for then this movement to develop. I think if they'd narrowed it too early, it may not have, have taken shape in the way that it did. Or similarly, in the next chapter on technology assessment, I talk about how ambivalence was used quite strategically to sort of enroll lots of different actors. So by kind of saying, that to sort of get lots of different people on board, rather than saying, this is really what we want it to be, by sort of leaving technology assessment quite open in terms of what it could be, it allowed to get more support. So I think, thanks.
What is undoubtedly an interesting discussion. The opposition will be continued by Professor Sally Randalls, Professor of Sustainability and Innovation at Manchester Metropolitan University in England.
Thank you. Danielle, you've written a superb, very interesting thesis. I'd like to congratulate you on that. I really enjoy the way it's a page turner, unusual in a PhD thesis, that it leads the reader through with curiosity as to where you wish to go next. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it and working with you now on defending it. I like the way you mobilized a thread throughout the thesis about how to make responsibility matter, how the actors that you followed made responsibility matter. And I like the notion of matters of concern and matters of care, and how those matters unfolded in the enacted history that you focus on. But my question is that it's a very challenging thesis that you took on, because you could have gone in many, many directions. You compellingly make the argument that we need a history of RRI. You're very brave. You take on establishment names in responsible research and innovation. You charge them with the triumphalist approach, which made me smile. I can see where you're coming from. And you charge them with ignoring history, ignoring voices, ignoring long histories in order to evidence the recency, make a case for the recency and the novelty of what they were saying. So why then, given the problems of the hermeneutic circles, that when you have the seeds of something that you don't know what it is, you don't know where to look, you don't know what the whole is, and therefore you need to be looking at go drill down into specific events before you understand anything about the whole, but you can't understand the whole until you start to understand some of the events. That's a very, very challenging process. So you made a compelling argument that you need a history of RRI, this triumphalist approach of the establishment figures. You made a compelling argument how to do a history of RRI. My question is, can you tell us more about the thought processes, the difficult thought process that made you come up with this particular history of RRI and not any other history of RRI?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you again for your kind compliments. And yeah, I think you very much put the nail on the head there in terms of it was very challenging, especially at the start, because I think, together with my supervisors, it was very much a very sort of open project from the beginning of, looking at responsible innovation and saying, okay, what kind of history do I want to do here, or are we interested in? And to me, that was very exciting because it gave me quite a lot of, say and sort of, and room to sort of explore what was interesting and what I was curious about. But at the same time, it was incredibly daunting. And it was very, very difficult, especially in the first year, to try and make sense of where I was going to go. I think for me, really sort of, trying to embed myself quite a bit in the responsible innovation community was a big part of it, and that I really tried to do in the first year. As I said in the presentation, going to a lot of conferences and meetings and all these sorts of things, and really trying to get an idea for, as I say, and as I'm quite, as you said, sort of critical of, history doesn't play a big role, but even if we're not explicitly talking about histories, you can sort of see, through spending this time in and around the community, you sort of see how implicitly certain histories are drawn upon. And that's really through spending a lot of time with people, whether it's they're presenting responsible innovation to a new audience, and then maybe there's one slide giving some kind of background of where this came from. And then something like STS might get a small mention, or technology assessment might get a small mention. As I say, these sort of folk histories that are, told over and over get a very short mention. And I think those are what gave me my first signposts of, okay, they're presenting this sort of very short, potted version of this history. But is that really, kind of exactly what was going on here? I think I wanted to sort of open it up a bit and maybe see what else was going on there behind this very brief presentation. So I think it was really through, spending time in and around the community that I picked up on these little hints and traces. So I tried to be sort of guided by the actors, essentially. So even though the history wasn't very present and wasn't very explicit, I really tried to sort of look for these little signs that then I could sort of follow. And of course, there were other things that I followed along the way, and some that didn't end up making it. And there's all sorts of, reasons that go into those choices. Some are purely pragmatic in terms of what you can find and what you can follow. But I think for me, these ones, the ones that I ended up choosing, really sort of made a lot of sense. The more I sort of went back and forth between history and the contemporary movement, made a lot of sense, and they wove together nicely. But I think certainly there's a lot more to be done and a lot more histories to open up and that are relevant. You know, if we're talking about responsibility, it's a very big idea to the practices of responsibility that are associated with all sorts of different fields. I think there's still a lot more there to explore, and I'm very much looking forward to, I know you're also working on doing that as well, and looking forward to the work you have forthcoming on that too.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Kelly Moore, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Loyola University, Chicago in the United States, who is now with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to read a very interesting thesis, which with a very rich empirical base and many provocative and interesting conceptual contributions. The question I have is about the use of the concept of ambivalence in your thesis. This concept is used throughout your thesis to characterize the attitudes and perspectives of various actors toward technology itself. Yet the thesis is actually a thesis about, and the book is actually a book about how technology should be governed, who should be governing it, who is, quote, responsible for it, and what are the terms and conditions under which the governance will take place. There is also a second tension here, which is that in some parts of the project, actors are fully enthusiastic and interested in the idea that technology will solve problems. It is a net positive. It needs some reining in or direction. In other places, there are more critical views of it. But in no place in the thesis, given the cases that you've selected, did it seem that there was any ambivalence about the governance itself. It was a set of questions about how governance might take place. I should also add as well, too, that in some parts of the thesis, you gesture toward the influences of more international actors, particularly those in developing countries where, I guess, which would have been characterized in the 70s and the 60s as third world countries, that had very positive views about technology and the ways in which those movements and those countries' perspectives influence some of the groups you're studying in Europe and the USA. So that is a preface to ask for a more robust defense of the use of ambivalence to characterize the three waves or moments of attention to responsible technology that are in your book. Thank you.
Opponent, thank you for your kind words and nice to meet you virtually. I think, thank you for providing me with this opportunity. I think I would maybe turn it around a little bit and say that I think I agree with you that, that I sort of trace ambivalence in terms of views with regards to technology and technological change, but I don't think necessarily many of the actors in the book are particularly ambivalent about the governance side. I think, as you say, I think they're all pretty clear that that's what they want to, that that's what they're in support of. So I think it's not so much kind of saying where is the ambivalence there or what kind of ambivalence is there, because I don't think they were. I think, throughout most of the book, it's really looking at quite a tightly sort of networked group of actors who have sort of a considerable amount of social capital and are kind of quite invested, and although they want, sort of a greater democratic control of technology, they also kind of want, there's still that sort of technocratic side of wanting, certain forms of expertise to still have a guiding hand and to still sort of, very much be steering the way. So I think in that sense, I don't think there is much ambivalence over what it is, that they sort of want to do, or how they want to, how they want that to play out. And I think in some ways, I think that also probably corresponds with much of the responsible innovation movement as well. And then I think, as you said, with with regards to the, I think this, sorry, the second, could you remind me the second part of the question? So more to do with the Global South?
Yes, the question I had about that is that you gesture in several places in the book toward the fact that in other parts of the world, there are ways of governing technology that are that look different than what was being developed in Europe and the USA, and the ways that those enthusiasms for technology, the necessity of technology, harnessing technology in a very positive way. Technology is associated with modernity, it's associated with success in the around the globe. That there's that sense that seems not particularly ambivalent. People are quite enthusiastic about it in many ways. Now, there are critiques, of course, in India and other places about what has happened, but it seems that there's more going on than what the thesis is showing, partly because strategically you have made a decision to focus on as you have just said, a fairly close-knit group of elite people who have a particular perspective. So this is also a way of saying that there are possibilities for looking differently, even at your cases, by having more attention to the non-ambivalence, rather than having ambivalence be uniform, evenly distributed across all your cases, across all time.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you. And I think, as you say, of course, yeah, there is that tension there, certainly towards the end of the book, where there is, where the appropriate technology movement was, really sort of stretched across perhaps a broader geographical location than the other movements that I looked at, certainly within the way I frame it in the book. And and I think this was certainly, one of the factors of why appropriate technology as a movement sort of, slowly sort of start to kind of unwind or sort of unravel, is I think precisely because of this, because where it was sort of being deployed at first, if you like, or where it was kind of first taken up, Schumacher's first concept of intermediate technology, with this notion of kind of really being between some kind of basic technology and some kind of high technology, was not exactly popular, let's say, with a lot of the countries where they sort of, were trying to implement these ideas. So I think, as you say, there's definitely a lot of space to really look at and to follow those threads further. And that's something I definitely like to do, and I think would be really important, especially when we look at sort of responsible innovation, trying to have quite a global reach, to really look at some stories from, all sorts of other places as well, and see what kind of sense that will help us to make.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Karen Bijsterveld, Professor of Science, Technology and Modern Culture here in Maastricht.
Thank you. Dear PhD candidate, dear Dani. So congratulations with your wonderful book, which I've read with great pleasure. And you intended to make it a great read, and I think you succeeded in doing so. And I even have already made use of your insights in teaching, especially your idea of doing a historical ethnography, and that has made it into a lecture on research design in the Research Master Cast, the program that you've done yourself. So, of course, during that lecture, I referred to your upcoming defense, and actually, I hope that some Cast students are here. So, in my view, it has been very fruitful to use ethnography to write the history of responsible innovation as an intellectual movement, especially, including the folk history that the movement is writing itself or creating itself. But I have also a question about historical ethnography. At first, in your first chapter, you explained that after you had familiarized yourself with how RI's history was typically represented, so by members of the practice and in the scholarly literature, you did also qualitative interviews with 19 leading figures. And if I have understood it correctly, then that is also part of that ethnography, which is usually the case. You hang around and you talk to people. And in this case, so 19 leading figures. Now, for your key question on how different conceptions of responsibility have been made to matter, I think that is very wise to focus on those figures. But you also wanted us to remind us, and that's what you said in the presentation as well, you know, that at different times in different places, RI could have been otherwise, right? Like you wanted to, you were interested in the neglected parts, the forgotten, the ignored narratives. So you wanted to open the folk history. Now, with that in mind, focusing on leading figures is dangerous, as this might lead to a winner's history, to what we call, you know, technically call finalism. So, yeah, my big question is, how did you deal with that danger? Also because the archives were also related to these leading figures. So you don't say much about that. You say, okay, these were related to these leading figures. So how did you deal with the danger?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you again for very kind words about my thesis, and I'm thrilled to hear that it's already made an appearance in CAST. That's really lovely. Yeah, I think, I really welcome the opportunity, and I would love to also talk with you a lot more about, this idea of historical ethnography. I think it's something that, needs to be thought through a lot more. I try to sort of, explore it a little bit in the thesis. I think, as you say, I mean, I did these interviews. As I said in the presentation, I participated in all sorts of different things during the first year. I think, I mean, if you look at the annex, if you look at the list of interviews, I mean, I sort of, refer to it as leading figures, but I did really try to, choose people from a range of different positions that were working, in well-established projects and so on. So, because I completely recognize what you say of this sort of danger or this trap, but I think the best way I can say that I try to sort of deal with it is by really, sort of doing this ethnography right from the start. So really going to, luckily when I started, it was really in this sort of peak of responsible innovation. Every week there was a conference or a workshop or a seminar associated to responsible innovation, so I could go to a lot of things. And as you say, doing ethnography, then speaking to lots of people that I didn't list as interviewees as well. So really trying to get a very broad picture of people's experience within responsible innovation and of how they came to it, of how they understood where it came from. And it was really through that sort of rounded picture that then I started to see, okay, these are the recurring things that sort of are there, but no one really quite, sort of fully knows or explains quite why they're there. They just, as I say, and that's how I came to folk histories, is it sort of, these are the ways everyone explains it, but they don't really know how or why they explain it that way. But as I say, I think, I recognize that it's a potential trap, and I would say, that's the best way I tried to counter it. But of course, we have to think about, being responsible and thinking about responsibility. We have to think about, who is being heard, who is having a voice in this, and that's why, as I said previously to one of the earlier questions as well, I think there's a lot more to do and a lot more voices to also to look at within this discussion.
Thanks.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Gert Somsen, Associate Professor in the History of Knowledge here in Maastricht.
Esteemed candidate, dear Danny, just like my predecessor, I'd like to congratulate you with a fine thesis. Indeed, it's very well written, and on my account also really a joy to read, a page turner indeed. And let me remind those here who do not do such thing for a living, easy reading is damn hard writing, as the saying goes. Your dissertation is on the history of RI, maybe, if I may be inclusive, more broadly speaking of STS, and as such it might appear an extremely academic exercise. You're a scholar looking at scientists who are thinking about science. It looks an awful lot like what we Dutch call staring at your belly button. But it isn't, I think. Your digging into the precursors of responsible research and innovation really brings up large and important themes, dilemmas really of truth and power, and it really succeeds in showing how our modern societies have struggled with themselves. But enough praise here. Let me get to the nasty bits and ask you a critical question. You have chosen to study RRI and its precursors as an intellectual movement. And according with that, I think your thesis bears all the marks of an exercise in intellectual history. And with that comes strength as well as weaknesses. The strengths are, I think, that it does a very good job in recognizing the many and often subtle differences in thinking about science and technology in society. But of course, I'm going to focus on the weaknesses, and the weaknesses of intellectual history that show here are that your analysis is focused at the level of thought a lot, and does not always go beyond this that much, even when such seemed required. For example, in chapter 2, on page 68, you note that IBM, the computer firm, was the software firm, I should say, was a major force behind launching the Technology and Social Change University seminar at Columbia University in 1962 to 63. The same IBM, we'll learn in page 83, was also a main financier for $5 million, no less, of the Technology and Society program at Harvard University, attracting its first director from the Rand Corporation. Now, this corporate context raises the question as to what these businesses wanted to achieve through these discussion platforms. Your dissertation does provide some answers, but mainly at the level of individuals' beliefs and concerns, not corporate interests or university politics. And my invitation to you is, could you reflect on those dimensions now?
Esteemed opponent, thank you once again for your very kind words about my thesis. I agree that, yeah, as we would say in English, there is a bit of navel-gazing, definitely, and yeah, I definitely experienced that throughout the process of doing it. I completely recognize, yeah, what you're saying about the weaknesses of intellectual history, and I think, I mean, one retort would be, of course, that, yeah, if I'm looking at the idea of response, I'm looking at an idea. So I'm tracing the idea, I'm tracing the thought. But by looking at it as an intellectual movement, I try then a bit to also look at sort of some of the structures and, you know, some of the institutions, some of the various sort of networks and groups, you know, and the ways in which they interact and the ways in which these different ideas traveled through them. I think, as you say, if thinking about the IBM example, IBM and Columbia, and the sort of close relationship they had in getting a particular sort of seminar going in the 70s, which I talk about in chapter 1, in the 60s and 70s. I mean, I've thought about this a bit more, and I think about, yeah, what IBM were getting out of it and what Columbia were getting out of it, and I think it was quite a bit of, you know, I'll scratch your back, you'll scratch mine going on. I think there was something in it for both of them. I think for, you know, for Columbia, obviously, there was the investment, there was the money. And I think both could kind of, there was a huge amount, I think, as you even said there, of sort of personnel exchange and knowledge exchange that went on between these institutions. People were quite regularly moving between them. But I think that's how perhaps they would, yeah, prefer to frame it. But I think in another way, you know, as I said right from the beginning, in terms of the public ambivalence at the time towards particular technologies, I think these sorts of relationships were really a way of also convincing the public that they were, you know, and of kind of getting some public sway of, you know, we're really looking into these things, and we're, you know, we're anticipating, we're trying to anticipate impacts, and we're trying to think through, you know, longer term what might be the outcomes of this, and then sort of, you know, being able to sort of give present it as research-based or evidence-driven, and really, the idea that they would take this research back and use it. So I think there was various things that were going on and various ways in which, both institutions were sort of benefiting from the relationship.
Okay, thank you very much.
We still have time, so I would like to invite Professor Randles to continue the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. So inclusion and inclusivity is one of the principles of contemporary responsible innovations, taken very seriously, critically, as to how that can be brought about. as you acknowledge, and it was quite troubling through the earlier chapters, that what we seemed to be seeing in reality was an elite network of, as you acknowledged, white, middle-class, male elite groups. They happened to come from different spheres of practice and action, from the elites of university, they were the captains of industry, and they were from the democratic wing of the American government at the time. But bearing that in mind, who is participating and where is the power in your thesis?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the opportunity to think on this a little bit further. I agree. So one of the sort of major pillars or principles of contemporary responsible innovation is inclusivity. And I think what's interesting looking at the movements that I look at in the 60s and 70s is, as you say, there were these quite sort of heterogeneous groups, or at least they thought they were pretty heterogeneous at the time. And I think that's perhaps an important point, is I think, it was pretty common then that, you would just have a group of scientists or a group of, that they would be quite separate. So in all these different, seminars or various workshops and things that I look at, there was a lot of sort of patting each other on the back for how well they were doing, for all sitting in the same room and having these conversations. And while from our contemporary perspective, that might not, we might not be so impressed by that, I think in some ways, I guess it was a first step towards, the sorts of interdisciplinarity or the sorts of inclusivity that we now have come to expect. I think, it perhaps might not seem like much now, but I think it was a first step towards that. And I think in terms of who is participating and where is the power, I think, this is also, as we've sort of said a little bit already, we see who was participating, and of course, there weren't particularly diverse voices, as you say yourself, at the time. But I think that's one of the important, perhaps, discontinuities between the history that I look at in the 60s and 70s and contemporary responsible innovation. Because I think for the other pillars of responsible innovation, so whether it's anticipating the impacts or sort of responding to societal needs, so they have these 4 pillars of anticipation, reflexivity, responsiveness, and inclusion. I think for the first 3, I really see a lot of continuities between what they were thinking about in that time period and now, whereas I think the inclusivity one is perhaps the one where we see a bit more discontinuity, and that there has been a far bigger shift or change. So as I say, I would say it's maybe I think we can see it as sort of a first step towards inclusivity, but I think it's certainly completely sort of changed shape and become a far more central part of the discussion now.
Thank you.
Dr. Moore, do you have another question for us?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you also to my esteemed colleagues for their earlier comments. I wanted to ask just a simple and straightforward question about your case selection. That is, you've chosen a number of cases to help illuminate a key thesis. Yet I wondered about the choice selection for 2 reasons. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about whether you might add a case or think about cases in different ways, given what I'm about to say. Your cases, the thesis is about responsible innovation, yet at the beginning of the project, you're actually not talking about what is called responsible innovation. That term hadn't been invented at that time. People were thinking quite differently about what they were trying to do to govern, in particular, large-scale technologies. There were, during that time period, people trying to govern technologies in different sorts of ways. But the notion of innovation is fairly recent in the history that you tell. It's actually and conceptually quite an important move intellectually and politically to characterize technologies as innovations. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the importance of including the earlier cases in particular that were not centered on the notion of innovation, but rather on the governance of technology in your project, or make other comments that would help us to understand how your case selection has influenced the kinds of claims that you're making about this as an intellectual movement.
Esteemed opponent, thank you again for presenting an opportunity to think a bit further on this. I think, as you say, the case, well, as I've explained previously, the cases that I chose really came out of this ethnographic work that I did at the start, and I think that I also tried to conceptually really follow what I found, through exploring these cases. So I really chose, that was pretty much how I made that decision to focus more, think more about technological change and as you said, the governance of technologies, because that is how the actors I was looking at, that's how they were talking about it. I tried to do a little bit of work in spaces in the thesis to sort of think about this relationship between innovation and technology. I think, scholars like Benoit Godin has done a lot of work looking at that, and I think that's a much larger project to really look at kind of, these sort of how a sort of intellectual history, if you like, of sort of these changing notions and how they relate to one another. As I say, I try to sort of dip in and out of that a little bit where it's relevant through the thesis. But I would say, that I recognize that, of course, responsibility wasn't a language, it wasn't sort of a conceptual tool or sort of terminology at the time. But I think on that side, I really try to sort of, unpack, and as I just mentioned, sort of those 4 pillars, unpack the sort of the bits of what we now consider responsible innovation to be. I sort of try and unpack them and show how they were, visible, even though that language wasn't there to sort of refer to them yet. So I think, that's what I really try to do with both responsibility and innovation, is to sort of say, okay, they weren't using those labels at that time, but how can we see what this idea now represents today and how it's visible, how it was visible in other places and in other times without being, known under that label or under that term.
May I just Yes. May I just say one other thing about the comments that you've just made, which is that while those things might have been visible and hidden in some other way in the earlier periods, it does seem important historically to note when they become highly visible, highly salient, highly important for the actors as part of an intellectual movement that, after all, is also writing its own history. And that is one of the challenges and the exciting parts about studying elites, is that they are also writing their own histories, even as we are studying them as historical actors. But drawing out the visibility of when innovation comes to supplant, in many ways, other ways of talking about what people had previously called technology, I think would go a long way as well to helping advance some of the arguments that you're trying to make.
Thank you. I completely agree. I think you're right that in sort of fleshing out these histories more and more, I think that would definitely be a very interesting way to sort of approach further sort of case selection for looking at, additional histories in kind of, like I say, adding more flesh to the bones of the kind of history that I've tried to do here.
The opposition will be continued further by Professor Bijsterveld.
I have another chance. So to talk once again about the interviews, actually, because I noted that although you say that you speak about these, or that you did the interviews, you do not refer often to them. Why is? Yeah, so it's fine.
Did you get where that question was going? Would you like to answer it very briefly?
I get where the question is going. I don't know if I can answer it very briefly, but I think it was in various forms of different chapters. There was lots of quotes in there at one point, but it just became the way I decided to create the narrative in the end. They ended up, unfortunately, being on the cut pile. But I think, when you write 20, 30,000 words for a chapter and have to cut it down like I do, some things have to get cut out, unfortunately.
You can just write more.
Danielle Shanley, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Please all rise.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Can't fly by now, don't waste all your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile.
Danielle Shanley, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Modi is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Danielle Shanley, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificates signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Now the real fun. So, Danny, many congratulations. Yeah, this is a great moment. If you let me walk down memory lane just a little bit, when I moved here in 2015, one of the very first Maastricht University functions I went to was Karen invited me to come see the presentations of the cast theses, yours prominent among them, and I remember saying to Karen afterwards, that Danny, she's really good. She'll be a great PhD candidate someday if she wants to be. So I'm very happy that that proved to be correct. I don't know if this is exactly the thesis that you would have chosen for yourself, but Daryl and I tried to create a kind of North American thesis project where you would have plenty of scope to define the field through your own explorations and through your conversations with us. And I have to say that those conversations were among the most interesting that I've had in my time in academia. So I had a lot of fun. Then came the doing. So you rose to the challenge of some new methods. And in terms of the ethnography, you became a full participant observer, a real participant in the RRI community, but also someone able to achieve the critical distance to comment both on the present and the past, and now also the future of RRI. You'd already done some interview work for your master's thesis, but now you really learned to do interviews in the mode of an historian, to draw out people's stories, and also to use the interviews to gain the confidence of people who then sent you giant boxes of materials they had collected and took you into the fold of the Columbia seminars. So that, yes, really impressive there. I think probably the method you had the most trepidations about was archival research. But it seemed to me that in the end you caught the archive bug and that you had some fun going from library to library and opening up dusty boxes. At any rate, you proved that you could do archival research very well. And then finally came the writing. So There, I think you experienced all of the pleasure and the pain of academic writing that the rest of us have experienced. The challenge of putting yourself on the page, of summoning the willpower to write what needs to be written. But there, Daryl and I continuously saw that you were making progress, even in the days when I think you weren't able to see that so well for yourself. And of course, the final product, as almost everyone has said, is a very, very good read. So really, congratulations, and enjoy the moment. Daryl, what would you like to say?
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this journey with you. It's been really enlightening. My desk is filled with so many notes of references that you have throughout your work. And like Cyrus, a bit of memory lane. You were in a course in the CAST program many years, in 2013, I think. And even then, your ability to take charge and to do the best work possible was really memorable. But I remember most was your time as before your PhD, when you were teaching quite a bit at FASOS. And I think you taught every course that we have on offer. And you did so without ever questioning, you know, the role. You could always be counted on to do that. And the dissertation itself and writing the dissertation is always so difficult. And like Cyrus, I always had confidence that the contours of the book were there. And I think sometimes you maybe felt my confidence was not well-founded. But I always knew you could do it because of that experience of working with you over the years and knowing full well that the final product was even better than I could have imagined. So congratulations.
Dear Dr. Shanley, also on behalf of the Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree that you have acquired. I don't think I do this yet. I would now like to invite the people present to make their way to the Refter, where there will be a reception. The members of the committee, Dr. Shanley and her paranymphs, will remain here to take a photograph, and we will join you in a few minutes. This ceremony is now closed. Not very loud.
Oh my God.
You are right, like,
Oh my God.
see?